I want to ask you about American politics. I mean, is it really just a coincidence that the Biden graft scandal involves a Ukrainian element, that the Trump impeachment involves a Ukrainian element, that the Putin's puppet epithet resonates because of the presumption that the Russians had somehow compromised Donald Trump when he was president? Are these all just unrelated events, or is there some structural dynamic that yeah, are we at war? In effect, we are in Ukraine because of deep state machinations that are the subject of conspiracy theories, but that might have something to it anyway.
This is a very complicated matter. There's a lot of issues floating around in there. I think your comments do highlight the extent to which Ukraine has been of central importance for American foreign policy and to some extent for American domestic politics for the past 10 years or so. You know, just on President Biden, it's very important to understand that when he was vice president, that President Obama assigned him the Ukraine portfolio. So it was Biden, Vice President Biden, who handled the Ukraine issue. And in fact, he worked closely with Victoria Nuland and others to help foment the coup in 2014, which really got the ball rolling in terms of this crisis, which has now turned into a war. So Joe Biden himself has been deeply involved in Ukrainian matters for a long time. And just to add to that, when he became president in January 2021, he actually began to up the ante on bringing Ukraine into NATO. The crisis in Ukraine, which had existed since February 2014, that's when the coup happened. That's when the trouble started, February 2014. Biden comes into the White House in January 2021. It's no accident 13 months later, the war happens, because what's happening over the course of 2021 and early 2022 is that the Biden administration is upping the pressure on the Russians regarding NATO expansion. And this is when the Russians are scrambling to try to work out some sort of diplomatic solution so that it doesn't end up in a war. So you can see that President Biden, and before that, Vice President Biden, has been involved in Ukrainian affairs for a long time.
Okay, I'm going to let you go. I appreciate your time. I just want to close by asking you about the election that's coming up, our presidential election that's in the works. Trump, a likely nominee for the Republicans, and this issue about the conflict. How do you see it playing out? What role do you see that the Ukraine war issue is going to play in the dynamics of the upcoming election?
Well, Trump likes to argue that if he were elected, he would end the war right away. Trump likes to brag that he could have a heart-to-heart talk with Vladimir Putin. The two of them could put an end to this war, and the Ukrainians would live happily ever after, and we would as well. I don't think that's going to happen. You want to remember that when Barack Obama got elected and when Donald Trump got elected, both of them ran on the platform that they were going to change American foreign policy. As you well remember, Barack Obama opposed the Iraq War, and he believed that these forever wars made no sense, and he wanted to put an end to them and not start any more of them. And he wanted to alter American foreign policy in important ways. And Donald Trump, when he ran in 2016, he ran against liberal hegemony, which was the prevailing foreign policy at the time. When he ran for president, Donald Trump, he had a radical foreign policy prescription for what he would do if he got elected. Well, in the case of Obama and in the case of Donald Trump, the blob beat them back in both instances. Obama admitted as much in an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg when he was leaving office after 8 years. He had had very little impact in terms of changing basic American foreign policy. And the same thing is true with Trump. The problem that Obama faced and the problem that Trump faced is that when they looked around in the foreign policy establishment for advisors who shared their views, they could find hardly anybody. So both of them ended up appointing all sorts of key advisors who were part of the blob or part of the foreign policy establishment and shared the views that both Obama and Trump were running against. So what I'm saying here is Trump last time was defeated by the foreign policy establishment. And I believe if Trump is elected this time, he will be defeated by the foreign policy establishment. That it will be impossible for him to jump in bed with Vladimir Putin and work out a deal. To take this one step further, there is no deal to be worked out. It's just very important to understand that. There is no way that the West can back off from its security relationship with Ukraine. We cannot completely sever our security relationship with Ukraine. We might be able to say, we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO. We're not going to say at the same time that we will sever completely the security relationship with Ukraine, and we will allow Ukraine to become a neutral state that has no security guarantee from the West. We will not let that happen.
Why not, John? Why not?
Because we're too deeply invested at this point in time. Too many people are completely committed to Ukraine's security.
You've heard of the sunk cost fallacy, right?
It's the sunk cost fallacy. Yeah. But that's only one problem, Glenn. And by the way, just to be perfectly clear here, the Russians insist on Ukrainian neutrality. Again, that gets back to the causes of the war. They insist on a completely neutral Ukraine, and I'm saying we won't accept that. But that's only one issue. As you know, the Russians have already annexed Crimea, and they have formally annexed 4 oblasts in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. The Russians have made it unequivocally clear that they're not giving that territory back. And I find it hard to imagine, impossible to imagine they would give that territory back. The Ukrainians, for completely understandable reasons, want that territory back. They want Crimea back, and they certainly want those 4 oblasts back. But the Russians say you can't have them back. So how do you square that circle? What's the deal on territory that's workable? What's the deal that Donald Trump is going to work out? And what's the deal that Donald Trump is going to work out on the neutrality issue? I don't see it. Now, you could say that Trump is an independent variable. He'll see that these 2 issues are the key issues and that he has to accommodate the Russians on both of them, and he'll go and do that all by himself. I don't think that's the way American politics works. I don't think he could possibly get away with that. So my view is if Donald Trump wins, then we'll have a policy that's not much different than the one that will obtain if Joe Biden or some Democrat gets elected instead of Trump. I've often said that if you look at the Republican Party's foreign policy and the Democratic Party's foreign policy, it's basically Tweedledee and Tweedledum. There's just not a whole heck of a lot of difference between the two. We, Glenn, are joined at the hip with Ukraine for the foreseeable future.